Europe deserves to be flooded by immigrants. Based on the actions and policies of Western countries like the US, France, and Germany, or the UK, there's no better destiny that karma can ever possibly prepare for them. Convoys of refugees? Check. Wretched and impoverished people, unready to quote-unquote integrate and adapt in the country they arrived at? Check. Increase in poverty and crime rates? Check. Instability of the political system? Check. All fully deserved. Every single bad thing that comes with an influx of impoverished, culturally stubborn, partially unskilled or uneducated people from Africa, the Middle East, from Asia, or the Balkans is exactly what the West deserves. It's what it needs to learn a valuable lesson of how what goes around comes around. By taking a look at the root causes of the waves of refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, and guest workers alike into the promised land of the West, it really doesn't take much time to realize that they brought all of this upon themselves. The millennia-old geopolitical policy of Western nations has finally reached its boiling point and has culminated into the heap of problems they're now forced to face. And now finally facing the consequences of their actions that they've been beneficiaries of for centuries, many Westerners are starting to panic and are suddenly enthusiastic to support the next wall, wired fence, or right-wing policy to prevent foreigners from coming in, and even forcefully expelling those who manage to come through. The rise of right-wing and outright fascist parties in countries like France, Germany, and Italy, and even Eastern European nations such as Poland and Hungary, seems to have been a natural course of events and expected reaction to the ever more intense cultural clash between immigrants of a predominantly Muslim cultural heritage and the good old Western civilization. And I'm pretty sure that there's plenty of people with such concerns and convictions watching this very video. I understand and empathize with the fact that it sucks to see your home country erupt in flames of a intercultural conflict, and that's precisely why you deserve to hear the harsh truth. You deserve to know who is responsible for the quote-unquote downfall of the West, who to actually blame, and why that long-expected downfall is actually very much deserved. But let me ask you something first. Haven't you noticed, despite all of the prejudice against men of Turkish or Arabic origin, just how crisp and well-kept those goddamn beards are? I mean, man, with those beards, no wonder conservatives are afraid of them quote-unquote stealing their women. But worry not, because Manscaped, the sponsor of today's video, has the right solution to help you step up your game. With the might of their Beard Hedger Pro Kit at your disposal, anything is possible. Now obviously, the star of the game is the Beard Hedger Trimmer. The powerful 7200 RPM motor and titanium-coated T-blade can cut through the thickest of hairs in a single stroke. Being waterproof, cordless, and rechargeable, you can easily trim in the shower to save time and create less mess. And to top it all off, Manscaped also created dermatologist-tested beard care products to help you grow and nourish a magnificent beard. So what are you waiting for? Go to manscaped.com today and get 20% off plus free international shipping when you use the promo code BALKAN at checkout. Thank you to Manscaped for sponsoring, and now back to the video. So, how did we get here? How and when did the tsunami of immigrants, foreign workers, and asylum seekers even begin? Who was actually to blame for the whole circus? Well, with a quick glance, a few links down the chain of causality, the answer shines as bright as day. We only need to keep asking one simple question. Why? Why are these people migrating to Europe and the USA en masse? Asking anyone who's ever left anything behind to move to an unknown foreign country will quickly give you the answer. Everything is simply better in the West. The economy, the pay, the living conditions, the educational healthcare system, etc., etc. But why? Well, already here we could easily fall into the very first trap. Many Westerners will immediately conclude that things are way better in their corner of the world simply because they took better care of it, because they were more hardworking and less corrupt, because they, as white people, inherently possess the qualities needed to build a civilized, advanced society based on quote-unquote Judeo-Christian values. In turn, the only seemingly valid conclusion is that the rest of the world, the 90% of the planet, simply are not. That they are backward and underdeveloped due to their own cultural and genetic predispositions and are therefore simply inferior. Voila, Nazi race science has entered the chat. Even though most Germans, Englishmen, and Frenchmen will never conclude this so blatantly and rapidly, this is what the well-intended advice subconsciously boils down to. A condescending, chauvinistic, and patronizing attitude of how the West is simply more capable, more culturally predisposed, and inherently more advanced, allowing them to build a more prosperous society, opposed to the browns, the blacks, and the yellows over there in the Orient. In turn, the West supposedly possesses all of the answers and methods needed to educate and guide the rest of the world on how to battle corruption, how to run their political system, and how to be more free, blessed by the grace and wisdom of the white man. The white man's burden has entered the chat. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We still need to answer the question of why everything is better in the West and why everything sucks in the rest of the world, or at least provide a better and more profound answer. The short answer is that the West has acquired all of its wealth and riches and has been able to develop more rapidly at the expense of the rest of the world. A quick glance at any elementary school textbook on colonialism or imperialism will provide you with an answer of how this was done. For hundreds of years, Western European countries have been colonizing, settling, pillaging, ravaging, and genociding the global South. Given the fact that there were centuries worth of resources to pillage in Africa and South America, it becomes apparent that those countries were never really poor, but actually unbelievably rich. They were never poor or underdeveloped, but merely robbed and overexploited. In this era of history, they've acquired mountains of wealth in the form of minerals, natural resources, and cheap labor power in a process known as primitive accumulation, whose material base served as a starting point of mass industry and, in turn, capitalism as a new socioeconomic system. Countries with the most favorable geographical and geological circumstances for developing the necessary industrial technologies and equipment, and those adjacent to the Western colonial core, were the first ones to rapidly develop the capitalist mode of production and reap all of the benefits of mass industrial production compared to agrarian feudalism, giving them the edge needed to continue dominating on the world stage well into the 19th century. But wait a minute, pause. Isn't the fact that the West were the ones to become advanced enough to colonize the world actually proof that there is something inherently more advanced about them? Aha, checkmate. Well, not so fast. The ultimate reason why the likes of Great Britain, France, Portugal, and Spain managed to conquer the Americas and Africa is, well, judge for yourself. I'll give you a minute. Bingo, it's because of geography. Not only did these countries have immediate access to the Atlantic Ocean and therefore the vast frontiers of North and South America, as well as the entirety of Africa, but combined with the very temperate and tame climate of Western Europe and the availability of all necessary raw resources to develop the massive war machinery needed to colonize, it shouldn't be surprising that these countries were the winners of the Spawn Point lottery and had all of the predispositions to become the rulers of the world. Compared to the Holy Roman Empire and Eastern European powers like Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and even Russia, which didn't have the adequate geographical or geological circumstances or political necessity to become colonial powers, and which had to content themselves with continental conflicts and becoming regional powers, the West was free to plunder, to exploit, to massacre, and to enslave globally. Centuries of this sort of disbalance of powers have compounded into a geopolitical constellation which resembled nothing else but complete and utter subservience of the rest of the world to their white overlords, in a social relation of clear and direct overexploitation and impoverishment. And, ironically enough, the very first dark-skinned immigrants that arrived in the West, most notably North America, were the very slaves they kidnapped, traded, and utilized as free labor power. So from the very beginning has the West, with its own policies and actions, brought the wretched souls of the Third World to their own front door. It's safe to say that there is very little to admire about this era of human history. Even some of the more reactionary folks will admit that this era is nothing to be proud of. But, as many would be quick to point out, all of that is in the distant past. None of it seems to be relevant for our modern predicament. Empires have crumbled, decolonization took place. All of these third world countries are now free, sovereign developing nations that can essentially do whatever they desire with their destinies. Nobody's forcing the people to move out. How can they still blame the West for their poverty and demise when it's their own local politicians that are corrupt, draconic, and dictatorial, and when they've had decades to catch up? Who else can they blame for their own inability to build democratic institutions, to join the free market, and walk the path of prosperity just like the so-called developed world? Well, the answer is quite straightforward. The ghosts of the past still very much haunt the present and have in many ways adapted and transformed into another form that isn't instantly recognizable to the naked eye. Colonialism may have officially been dismantled on paper, but the colonial structures of economic, monetary, financial, and political control of the West over their former dominions remained, and arguably even expanded onto the likes of Eastern Europe and deep into Asia, which were never directly colonized. With the advent of capitalism as a generalized mode of production in the 18th century, the monopolization and oversaturation of the domestic markets, and in line with capital's inherent tendency to perpetually expand and conquer new markets, while dividing the world between the great powers, capitalist imperialism became the new norm by the beginning of the 20th century. The forms of dependence and exploitation morphed according to the changes in the socioeconomic system, as outlined by Lenin in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and later works like Imperialism in 21st Century by John Smith, The Wealth of Nations and Divided World, Divided Class by Zak Cope. Colonialism transformed into neocolonialism, and morphing together with capitalist imperialism, continued to hold the Third World in an iron grip of political hegemony and economic subservience. To believe that the powers that be would willingly give up their hegemony over so many resources, so much land and labor power, just because an Indian guy went on a hunger strike is unbelievably naive. Getting a flag, a national anthem, border controls, and a parliament filled with local elites does not constitute becoming a truly sovereign country. The mechanisms of how the imperial core holds these complacent comprador regimes in their pockets and directly and indirectly exploits the global working population through their national comprador elites are quite complex and really deserve a video of their own. Phenomena such as unequal exchange, super-exploitation, global labor arbitrage, and debt enslavement are just the tip of the iceberg of all of the methods of ensuring that wealth, resources, and labor power flows from the Third World into the so-called Promised Land. Nothing about the wealth of Western Europe, the USA, and their allies is pure chance or skill, nor is it fairly, humanely, or self-sustainably acquired. The seemingly lenient and humane versions of capitalism and their Western social democracies would never be sustainable if it wasn't for the wealth pillaged from the majority of the world's population. It's been created over the backs and through the sweat and tears of hundreds of millions of wretched souls that live in abject poverty and whose lives are being sacrificed at the altar of capitalism in the name of super profits. Just how many lives have been destroyed throughout this process, I've already explored in this video of mine. Now, keeping all of this in mind, it would be truly baffling to ask why these countries are poor and why people would want to leave. Okay, but why don't they do something about it? I hear you say. Well, they did, plenty of times. But any nation that ever dared to resist the grip of Western European, and most notably American, imperialist regimes would, as evidenced dozens of times throughout history, be cruelly punished. Just take a look at the likes of Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya or Saddam Hussein in Iraq, who dared to conduct the mere beginnings of an autonomous socioeconomic policy. The before and after compilations of countries before and after American and NATO intervention really speak for themselves. Whether through democratic elections or revolution, not a single government formed on this planet will persist or survive without the blessing of the United States and their allies. And if you don't align with the hyper-capitalist free market doctrine, the MMF's shock therapy and restructuring programs, and their ultimate judgments in all matters of domestic and foreign policy, well, there will be plenty of excuses to invade that country, to stage a coup d'etat, to meddle in their elections, to literally invade or bomb their civilian population, or finally send in death squads to finish the job. all in the name of freedom and democracy, all for the sake of keeping those countries poor, to have a vast pool of ultra-cheap labor power that can sustain Western consumerism, for extracting oil and gas, and for the sake of keeping their trillion-dollar military-industrial complex up and running. War after war after war, sacrificing the local population for endless military-industrial profits, whether it be Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Ukraine, and now Palestine. But don't take my word for it. Take a look at what the former CIA director had to say about this on live television.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians, we
don't do that now, though? We don't mess around other people's elections, Jim?
Only for a very good cause.
Can you do that? Do a Vine video on a former CIA director.
Only for a very good cause in the interests of democracy.
All right, thanks for being here. It's always great to see you.
Yeah, it really is that obvious. So in case you're interested into delving deeper into this topic, take a look at Killing Hope by William Bloom and The Triumph of Evil by Austin Murphy, or, consult your local map of American military interventions worldwide. So, when I say that the West is quite literally and directly responsible for the misery and poverty of the rest of the world, that they are the ones who have sowed chaos wherever they stepped foot, I really meant it. This is the net outcome of the destructiveness and inhumanity of Western European and American foreign policy. I mean, what else can anyone expect? What can you expect from people whose countries have been ravaged, genocided, exploited, and enslaved by the West for decades and centuries? Can you expect them, while fleeing the terrors of ISIS, of the Taliban, and other aberrations and dictatorial regimes, literally created by the United States of America themselves, not to flee their countries in pursuit of a better life? Can you expect many of them not to be poor, paranoid, and even radicalized when they finally arrive in Germany or France? They are merely following the trail of wealth that is being stolen and sucked away by the immense power of the imperial core. By receiving millions of immigrants and asylum seekers that they themselves created, and experiencing all of the unpleasantries of a war-torn and impoverished population with different cultural and religious conceptions arriving at their doorstep, they are merely tasting a small part of their own medicine, of the product of their own racist, fascistic, and destructive foreign policy. Having personally lived in Germany for almost a decade now, I've come to the realization that what the majority of working people, as the indirect beneficiaries of the spoils of imperial exploitation, would subconsciously want, is to keep the third world in its place, to have it silently subjugated in the background, out of sight, out of mind, to reap the benefits of the world's exploitation within the walled gardens of Elysium, guarded by minefields and barbed wire. Well, my friends, that's not how it works. What goes around comes around, and the illusion of social democracy as this self-sufficient system of capitalism with a human face is slowly crumbling, and the entire facade is steadily peeling off. With the increasingly obvious crisis of the capitalist order and all accompanying symptoms of inflation, stagnant wages, skyrocketing rent, the dismantling of workers' rights, the rights of women and minorities, and ultimately the inevitable refugee crisis, these supposedly free and liberal societies are slowly slipping into the abyss of fascism, with far-right parties gaining more and more traction in Germany, France, Italy, and the like. And quite expectedly, their scapegoat for the crisis, caused by the greed and incompetence of the ruling class, aren't the Jews this time. They have, in the eyes of neo-Nazis, been promoted to useful allies with their unequivocal and unwavering support to the genocidal apartheid regime, which is merely mirroring the foreign policy of their European and American sugar daddies directly on settler colonial soil. This time, the common main enemy are immigrants, in first line Arabs and Muslims, who are now officially responsible for quote-unquote the downfall of Western civilization and its illusion of democracy and prosperity. Alright, fair enough. But how on earth are we supposed to resolve this massive crisis? We can't just let millions of illegal refugees with unverifiable identities cross into Europe and live off of the social safety net and slack around while the rest of us work our asses off to sustain them, right? Well, let me stop you right there. First of all, the solution doesn't lie in the question of letting immigrants in or expelling them out. That right there is a short-term band-aid solution which will solve exactly nothing. Barring the entrance to the European Union or building a wall with Mexico will not solve the inherent reason as to why these people are so desperate to leave. If the imperialist countries of the West were to stop all of the wars being directly and indirectly fought on their behest and financed by their population's taxpayer money, effective immediately, already tomorrow you would not only see less refugees, but many people returning to their homes. Nobody likes being an outsider, an immigrant, let alone an illegal refugee or asylum seeker with no homeland and no address. Nobody gets excited about that kind of life. The vast majority would happily return and live in their countries with their people, but in peace and prosperity that every human being deserves. But until the West ceases their fascistic, predatory, and monstrous policy of wreaking havoc across the world as soon as someone tries to act against their interests, this idea will remain a utopia. As long as the global capitalist system, with fascism and imperialism as its appendages, continues to exist, there will be no world peace and no end to the refugee crisis. It will only get worse. Oh, and next time you find yourself furious at the government for sustaining hundreds of thousands of seemingly lazy and parasitic Muslims with its social security net, remember that they spend a lot more of your money on financing wars that brought those people here in the first place. Consider the billions of dollars they keep sending to Ukraine out of your pockets, while convincing you that migrants who are forced to live in poverty are actually your enemy. Don't be naive, and don't let them pit us against each other. Empathy and solidarity can go a long way, and the first step in overcoming this whole shit show is nothing else than internationalist class solidarity with your fellow workers, no matter where they come from, and the recognition of who is truly responsible and who is actually our common nemesis.